The morning sky over eastern England was a sheet of dull steel, the kind that swallowed sunlight and sound alike. Frost clung to the wings of the bombers lined up on the tarmac, each one painted with worn names and symbols. Heaven can wait. Liberty Bell, misfortune. Men moved through the fog like shadows, their breath hanging in pale clouds as engines coughed to life. Among them stood the B-17F, tail number 423393, its olive-drab fuselage streaked with oil and soot, a tired veteran of the winter skies. Captain Harold R. Adams pulled his flight jacket tight and glanced down the line of his crew, 10 men who had flown together too long to need words. They were young, but carried themselves like old men. The ground crew handed Adams a clipboard with the mission briefing. Target, Bremen. Altitude, 25,000 feet. Estimated enemy resistance, heavy. Inside the aircraft, the men moved with practiced rhythm. Sergeant Mac McNeil checked the twin .50 caliber guns in the tail. Lieutenant John Carver, the navigator, unfolded his charts across his knees, pencil already tracing the familiar route over the North Sea. The air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and coffee gone cold hours ago. By Zorro's 700 hours, the engines thundered in unison. The B-17 rolled forward, following the formation into the graying sky. England fell away beneath them, a patchwork of fields fading into fog. The North Sea stretched ahead, iron-gray and endless. At cruising altitude, the fortress settled into its rhythm. The constant drone of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines filled every corner of the fuselage. The crew spoke through intercoms, voices clipped and mechanical through static. Navigator to pilot, on course. Roger that. Radio, signal clear. Formation, holding steady. They passed through a layer of thin cloud, sunlight breaking in fleeting bursts across the aluminum wings. The men's faces were pale behind oxygen masks, goggles iced at the edges. Far ahead, another squadron shimmered like silver ghosts in the distance. 2 hours later, the coast of Germany appeared through the haze, a jagged line of gray beneath the clouds. Almost immediately, the flak began. The first black bursts erupted ahead, silent at first, then close enough to shake the airframe. The plane jolted violently. One of the waist gunners cursed into his mic. Splinters of shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. The air smelled of cordite and metal. "Hold formation," Adams shouted. "Tighten it up." The bomb bay doors opened. Below them, the city of Bremen was half hidden, under smoke. Anti-aircraft guns flashed from rooftops. The bombardier, Lieutenant Frank O'Hara, adjusted his sight, eyes fixed on the small black cross marking the target factory. Bombs away! The fortress shuddered as the payload dropped free. For a brief second, the plane felt lighter, almost graceful. Then the flak found them again. A deafening crack split through the left side. Engine number 2 burst into flame. The fortress lurched, banking sharply. Warning lights flared across the cockpit. "We're hit! Left engine's gone!" shouted the flight engineer. Adams fought the controls, boots braced against the floor. Smoke filled the cabin. "Feather it! Get that fire out!" The propeller slowed. The flames flickered, then died. But the damage was done. The bomber fell behind the formation, alone now, drifting in the sky. German fighters circled in the distance like vultures testing the air. "Navigator, give me a heading for home." Carver wiped frost from his map, trying to steady his hands. "West-northwest, back across the coast." They turned for England, limping through the clouds. The radio operator tried to make contact with base, but static swallowed every word. The last known signal was lost somewhere over the North Sea. Time blurred. The clouds thickened, and daylight faded into a white nothing. Snow began to fall, a swirling veil that erased horizon and ground alike. Adams squinted at his compass, but the needle drifted strangely, trembling between bearings. "Compass is off," Carver muttered. "Mag interference, maybe. I can't get a fix." "Use the stars." There are no stars. The wind screamed outside the fuselage. Ice crawled along the wings. The altimeter danced. Somewhere aft, one of the gunners whispered a prayer. For hours, the B-17 wandered through the storm. No coastline appeared, no sign of formation, just the endless roar of wind and the low, uneven heartbeat of 3 engines. By mid-afternoon, fuel was running low. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped below freezing. Frost rimed the controls, and every breath came out like smoke. Carver checked his map again. "We should have hit the channel by now." Adams frowned. "Then where the hell are we?" No one answered. Outside, the clouds broke for a moment, revealing a stretch of land far below. White fields, dark forests, a river cutting through them like a scar. "That's not England," someone said. It wasn't. It was the wrong color, the wrong shape, the markings of enemy territory. The crew fell silent. Adams' jaw tightened. "We're turning north. Keep low. Maybe we can make Denmark, or at least the coast." The bomber dropped below the clouds, skimming over snow-covered farmland. Church spires rose like needles through the mist. Somewhere below, sirens wailed faintly. Then the right engine sputtered, coughed, and went dead. "Fuel's gone on 3. Adams gripped the yoke. "We're gliding. Look for a field, any field." The ground rushed closer. Wind tore through the open seams in the fuselage. The men strapped in, silent now, eyes fixed ahead. At 500 feet, the pilot spotted a flat stretch of land, a clearing, maybe a field, and lined up the descent. The landing gear wouldn't lower. He forced the flaps. The bomber came in too fast. Impact, a scream of metal, snow, and splintered earth. The B-17 skidded, bounced once, and came to rest in eerie silence. The engines coughed one last time, then died. Only the ticking of cooling metal remained. The crew unbuckled, gasping for breath. Outside, the air was still. No gunfire, no shouts, just the faint hum of distant machinery. Carver peered through the cracked window and froze. The shape of hangars loomed on the far side of the field, a row of planes, not Allied, but marked with black crosses. They hadn't landed in safety. They had landed on a Luftwaffe airfield. Adams didn't speak. He didn't have to. The men understood. Every one of them reached for the sidearms they knew were useless. Outside, German soldiers were already gathering, their rifles raised. For a heartbeat, no one moved, neither the Americans in the plain nor the Germans in the snow. Just the strange, shared disbelief that this had actually happened. Adams exhaled slowly. "Destroy the maps," he said quietly. "Burn everything we can." But before they could move, a voice barked orders in German, and the airfield erupted in motion. Soldiers surrounded the fortress. Spotlights cut through the snow. The crew stood in the doorway, hands raised, the cold biting through their gloves. The war had carried them across a frozen sky, only to end here, in the heart of enemy territory. As they were led away, the B-17 stood silent in the snow, engines cooling, wings heavy with ice. The black crosses of the Luftwaffe reflected faintly in its polished metal skin, as if the plane itself were already changing sides. And above it all, the storm closed again, erasing tracks, sounds, and the last traces of direction, as if the sky itself wished to hide what had just occurred. The airfield was silent again by morning, though the tracks from the night's commotion still scarred the snow. The strange American bomber sat motionless on the edge of the runway, its olive-green skin glinting dully beneath a pale sun. Frost had covered the fuselage overnight, softening the edges of bullet holes, sealing the wounds of the previous day. German guards stood in a loose perimeter around it, rifles slung carelessly, their breath forming thin white clouds. None of them could quite believe what they were looking at, an American flying fortress intact, sitting peacefully on a Luftwaffe base as if it had always belonged there. When Hauptmann Dieter Falk, the base commander, arrived, the soldiers straightened immediately. He walked toward the aircraft with deliberate calm, boots crunching in the snow. His gloved hand brushed the cold metal of the nose section, tracing the faded white stars and bars. The paint was scarred, but the insignia was unmistakable. Falk peered through the cockpit window. The control column was frozen in mid-turn, gauges fogged with ice. Inside the cabin, flight manuals, coffee cups, and oxygen masks were scattered about, as though the crew had stepped out only moments ago. "Where are they?" he asked quietly. "No sign, Herr Hauptmann," a sergeant replied. "No parachutes nearby, no tracks in the snow except the landing skid." "They must have bailed before landing." "Perhaps, but the engines were shut down correctly, propellers feathered, flaps adjusted." The sergeant hesitated. "Someone landed it." Falk said nothing. He climbed up the side ladder, boots clanging against the metal. Inside the bomber the cold was biting. The narrow fuselage smelled faintly of oil, smoke, and something else. Sweat, perhaps, or fear. The cockpit told a story of calm professionalism. The throttles had been pulled back evenly, the landing gear lever frozen in the down position. The instruments, though cracked, still pointed to their last readings. Oxygen tanks empty, radios silent. Falk touched the pilot's seat, running a gloved finger across a small nameplate. Capped. H.R. Adams. The seat was still warm under the morning frost, as though someone had only just left it. Back outside, more officers had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Intelligence officers from nearby headquarters had been summoned. Photographers were already unpacking their cameras. The rumor had spread fast. An American bomber had landed itself on German soil, fully intact. Within hours, a convoy of trucks arrived, carrying engineers, mechanics, and Gestapo observers. The field became a hive of activity. Men surrounded the plane, sketching, photographing, labeling. They found everything inside just as the Americans had left it. Maps of northern Germany, mission plans marked in pencil, even a tin of chewing gum. The bomb bay was empty, the payload already dropped. In the radio compartment, a half-written message still sat in the typewriter. "Returning to base. Engine." The rest was smeared, unreadable. The strangest part, however, was the absence of any trace of the crew. No one had seen parachutes descending the night before. No local farmers had reported strangers wandering through the snow. There were no footprints leaving the site. It was as though the bomber had flown itself across the sky, made its landing, and then simply waited. By afternoon, the first report was on its way to Berlin. The message was short, almost clinical. Enemy aircraft B-17 type, serial number 423393, landed intact at Luftwaffe base Venlo. No crew. Plane undamaged. Cause unknown. At Rechlin Air Base, the Luftwaffe's top testing center, engineers reacted with disbelief. To capture a working flying fortress was beyond luck. It was a dream. For months, German designers had struggled to understand the full extent of American technology, their armor layout, radio encryption, bombing sites. Now, without a single shot fired, one had simply delivered itself to them. As dusk fell, the sky over Venlo turned to ash gray, and snow began to fall again. Guards kept watch around the aircraft, lanterns casting long shadows across its silent frame. Every so often, one of them swore he saw movement inside, a flicker near the cockpit, a glint of glass, a shape in the window. Each time they approached, there was nothing. The next morning, a team of engineers from Berlin arrived to begin the official examination. They circled the bomber methodically, like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. One of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Dr. Kruger, ran his hand over the smooth aluminum panels. "You could tell this machine was built for endurance," he murmured, riveted by men who knew it had to survive the North Sea. He ducked under the wing, inspecting the retracted landing gear. "Look at this," he said to another engineer. "There's barely any structural damage. Whoever landed it did it perfectly, on one engine at least." Inside, the Germans marveled at the craftsmanship. The radio compartment was a maze of switches and wires, far more advanced than many of their own aircraft. The bomb sight, the famous Norden, sat gleaming like a forbidden relic. They knew the Allies would rather destroy it than let it fall into enemy hands. And yet, here it was, untouched. The Germans worked in silence, documenting everything, each switch photographed, each panel sketched. They labeled the controls with neat handwriting, translating every English word. Outside, snow fell in heavy flakes, muting the sound of their boots. The airfield had become strangely reverent, almost church-like. The B-17 stood like a sleeping beast, an artifact from another world. That evening, a photographer from the Luftwaffe's propaganda department arrived. He asked Falk if he could climb atop the bomber for a picture. The Hauptmann hesitated, but finally nodded. The flash went off, bright against the gathering dusk. The photograph would soon appear in newspapers across the Reich, accompanied by triumphant captions: "American superfortress captured intact by German airmen." But among the men who had touched the aircraft, there was no triumph, only unease. That night, the guards heard the wind moaning through the hangars, a low, hollow sound like distant engines. Some swore the radio in the bomber crackled faintly, though the power was disconnected. Others claimed to have heard voices in English whispering through the static. Falk dismissed it as nerves. War and winter could play tricks on the mind. But when he climbed into the cockpit once more, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A thin trail of melted frost running down the pilot's control yoke, as though a warm hand had rested there. He touched it. It was still damp. For a long moment he sat in the pilot's seat, staring out through the cracked glass at the snow-covered field. The silence was complete, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone inside the aircraft. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the fuselage, came a soft metallic creak, the kind that metal makes when it cools or when someone moves. Falk turned sharply, flashlight beams slicing through the dark corridor toward the rear of the plane. Nothing. Just the gleam of empty gun barrels and the slow drip of melting ice. He exhaled, stepped down from the cockpit, and closed the hatch behind him. By dawn, the B-17 was already being prepared for transport. It would be flown, or rather towed, to Rechlin for testing. The Germans covered it with tarpaulins and chained it down for the journey. As the trucks rolled out, the snow erased their tracks once more. The sky above was empty, save for a single contrail far to the west, another formation of bombers heading for Germany, unaware that one of their own now rested in enemy hands. And on the airfield, beneath the settling snow, the frozen imprint of the B-17's landing gear remained, a perfect memory of a ghost that had crossed the sky and found no home on either side of the war. The convoy moved through the frozen countryside like a procession of ghosts. Snow drifted in long veils across the narrow roads, coating the tarps that covered the captured bomber. Soldiers marched alongside the trucks, rifles slung, their boots sinking into the slush. The strange prize, the American Flying Fortress, groaned softly on its flatbed trailer, chains rattling with each turn. When they reached Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's central testing base, the guards at the gate stared as if witnessing a hallucination. Even here, amid prototypes and wreckage of every sort, the sight of an intact enemy bomber was unthinkable. The guards saluted stiffly, their eyes wide, as the convoy rumbled past. Inside the hangar, floodlights blazed down on the captured aircraft. German engineers gathered in clusters around it, their voices echoing off the walls. The tarps were pulled away, revealing the dull green skin of the B-17. The paint was scarred but intact, the great white star still visible on the fuselage. It looked less like a machine of war now, and more like something fossilized, a creature preserved in ice. Major Reinhard Kruger, head of Foreign Aircraft Evaluation, approached slowly. He was a tall man with sharp features and the wary stillness of a hawk. He circled the plane once, hands clasped behind his back, eyes narrow with curiosity. "A miracle," he murmured. "A machine that lands itself?" Technicians climbed ladders, photographing every inch of the bomber. They spoke in hushed tones, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. Inside, the work began methodically. Every compartment was opened, catalogued, examined. The cockpit told of calm and control, switches in their proper positions, throttles precisely aligned. Even the oxygen gauges still registered faint pressure. There was no chaos, no sign of panic. Whoever had flown her last had done so with perfect discipline. In the radio compartment, the officers found the half-typed message again, the one that had cut off mid-sentence. The paper was brittle now, frozen where the ink had bled. A faint fingerprint smudged the edge of the sheet. Nothing more. The crew's personal effects were neatly stowed, helmets hanging on hooks, flight logs half-filled, photographs tucked behind instrument panels. One photo showed a young woman holding a dog, her smile blurred from moisture. On the back, in neat handwriting, "For Hal. Come home safe." Kruger turned the photo over in his hand for a long moment, then placed it carefully back where it had been. In the nose compartment, near the bombardier's station, they found a thermos of coffee, frozen solid, and a Bible with a page marked by a folded ration card. The marked passage read, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The Germans exchanged uneasy glances. By midday, the bomber had been completely mapped, photographed, and tagged. Kruger dictated notes to his assistant. Exterior condition, remarkable. Engine damage limited to port nacelle. Interior undisturbed. No trace of crew, no biological matter, no blood. Conclusion, unknown. Outside the hangar, the snow continued to fall in thick silence. The world seemed to hold its breath, around the captured machine? That evening, the officers gathered in the base command room to discuss what they had found. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air. A map of Europe spread across the table, pins marking Allied flight routes. "It makes no sense," said one intelligence officer. "The crew could not simply vanish." "Could they have bailed over the North Sea?" asked another. Kruger shook his head. "There were no reports of parachutes. No bodies washed ashore, and the controls show it was landed properly, not crash-landed. Someone flew it to the ground." A long pause followed. Someone poured coffee into metal cups. The wind moaned against the windows. Finally, Falk, the base commander from Venlo, spoke. "Perhaps the crew tried to land, realized where they were, and fled before we arrived." "On foot? In the middle of winter? Without leaving footprints?" Kruger's tone was dry. No, this was something else. For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, the hangar lights flickered as a gust of wind swept through the valley. In the distance, the muffled sound of an engine, one of their own, rose and fell. That night, Kruger walked alone through the hangar after the others had gone. The B-17 stood under the lamps like a sleeping colossus, its shadow stretching across the concrete floor. The metal seemed almost to breathe in the cold, contracting with faint creaks and groans. He climbed the ladder into the cockpit once more. The seat was just as he had left it. On the control panel, he noticed something he hadn't before, a small scratch etched into the metal beside the throttle quadrant. 3 letters, SOS. He leaned closer. The grooves were shallow, hurriedly carved with something sharp, maybe a knife or the tip of a bullet casing. Just below, another mark, almost invisible. North. He stared at the words, the faint tremor of a chill running through him. Behind him, the wind pushed against the hangar doors, setting the steel beams to humming. He turned, half expecting someone to be there. The space was empty, only the echo of his own movement filling it. He switched off the cockpit light and descended the ladder. The echo of his boots faded, but for a moment afterward, the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping continued. Like footsteps in the fuselage behind him, he stopped. Silence again. Kruger didn't mention it to anyone. In the following days, the Germans dismantled sections of the aircraft for study. Panels were removed, wiring traced, the engines disassembled bolt by bolt. Yet the unease never left the hangar. The workers moved quickly, always in pairs, unwilling to be alone with the plane for long. One morning, a mechanic refused to go inside. He swore that during the night he'd heard the bomber's engines turn over, once briefly, though the ignition was disconnected. Others laughed it off, but none volunteered to check. By the end of the week, the Luftwaffe had what it wanted: full blueprints of the B-17 systems, the layout of its armor, details of its radio and navigation gear. The data would soon be sent to Berlin, analyzed by men who saw machines as nothing more than puzzles to solve. But for those who had worked in the hangar, the fortress had become something else entirely, a mystery that refused to settle. A machine that should not have lived, yet had flown itself across enemy skies and come to rest in perfect silence. On the final night before the plane was moved again, Kruger returned once more, unable to resist. He stood before the bomber's nose, where the name had been painted in fading yellow letters. Lady Be Good. The irony was not lost on him. He placed his hand on the cold metal. "You wanted to go home," he whispered in English, almost gently, "but you came here instead." Outside, the snow had stopped. The air was still. The moonlight glinted off the wings, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw the faint reflection of 10 men standing beside the aircraft, faces pale, uniforms darkened with frost. When he blinked, they were gone. Only the fortress remained, silent, patient, and impossibly whole. The hangar at Rechlin was a cathedral of steel and silence. Floodlights burned through the frost-hazed air, throwing long shadows across the floor where the captured B-17 stood stripped and waiting. Its wings had been cleaned, the frost scraped away, revealing the dull sheen of American aluminum beneath the grime of war. The great bomber, once a symbol of Allied might, now belonged to the Luftwaffe. Major Reinhard Kruger watched from the observation balcony as his engineers prepared for the next phase. Below him, men in oil-stained uniforms swarmed the plane like surgeons over a patient. Wires trailed from open panels, instruments blinked faintly on portable generators, and the low hum of German voices mixed with the clink of metal on metal. Every component had been numbered and tagged. The once proud insignia of the United States Army Air Forces had been partially painted over, a crude black cross now stenciled above it. It looked wrong, a foreign symbol on an unwilling surface. The bomber seemed to resist it, as if even in captivity it refused to change allegiance. Kruger's assistant, Oberleutnant Weber, joined him, holding a clipboard thick with notes. "We've completed the fuel system analysis," he said. "Ingenious, really. They designed redundancy for nearly every line. If one's hit, another takes over. No wonder these beasts can limp home half dead." Kruger nodded absently, his eyes never leaving the plane. "And the armor?" "Mostly concentrated around the cockpit and lower fuselage. It's not thick, only enough to stop small-caliber fire, but it's placed with purpose. The Americans protect their men first, not their machines." "Typical," Kruger muttered. "They can afford to lose planes. We cannot." He descended the stairs and walked slowly along the bomber's flank, running his hand along the rivets. The metal was cold, rough beneath his gloves. Near the waist gun position, the engineers had set up a table of disassembled parts, bullet casings, radio fragments, even a damaged altimeter. Kruger paused, examining each one. A young engineer, barely 20, stood nearby, nervously waiting for the major to speak. "Sir," he said, gesturing toward the open radio panel, "you should see this. Their communication setup is years ahead of ours. Dual transmitters, frequency hopping, coded relays. It's a fortress in the air, not just an armor." Kruger bent closer, studying the mass of switches and coils. "And this device here?" "That's the Norden bomb sight," the young man said, almost reverently. "We've heard about it. The Americans guard them fiercely. They say it can drop a bomb into a barrel from 20,000 feet. Kruger frowned. "Can it?" "Perhaps not quite that, sir," the engineer said with a nervous smile, "but close enough to frighten Berlin." The bomb sight was unlike anything they had seen. Compact, intricate, built with a precision that bordered on obsession. They handled it with care, photographing every angle, sketching each internal lens and gyroscope. Somewhere in Berlin, scientists would soon be poring over these same photographs, hoping to replicate the heart of America's bombing accuracy. Meanwhile, mechanics dismantled the engines. The Wright cyclones, great radial beasts of power and noise, were laid open, pistons gleaming in the artificial light. German technicians moved like priests performing autopsy on a god. They admired what they saw, but with a quiet resentment. Every piece they touched reminded them how far behind their own industry had fallen in this desperate stage of the war. "Note the cylinder tolerances," Kruger said, leaning close. "They run hotter than ours, yet with less wear. Precision manufacturing, the kind we can no longer afford." Weber scribbled furiously beside him. "You sound almost envious, Herr Mayer." Kruger allowed himself a faint smile. "Envy is a form of respect." By midday the hangar smelled of oil and ozone. Generators whined, and the engineers' voices echoed between the metal rafters. A group of Luftwaffe officers arrived from Berlin, intelligence men all in immaculate uniforms and polished boots. They walked through the hangar as if inspecting a conquered city. One of them, a colonel from Göring's staff, stopped beside Kruger. "Impressive, Major. You've done fine work. Reichsmarshal Göring will want a full report within the week." Kruger inclined his head. "He'll have it. The machine is extraordinary. Built for endurance, for punishment. Our own bombers seem fragile in comparison." The colonel smiled thinly. "And yet this one sits in our hangar, not theirs." "Luck," Kruger said quietly, "and perhaps arrogance." The colonel laughed. "You sound almost superstitious, Major. Surely you don't believe the stories? That it landed itself?" Kruger didn't answer. He glanced toward the bomber's cockpit. In the harsh light, the frost on the inside of the windows had melted slightly, leaving streaks that looked almost like fingerprints. That night, the hangar was empty except for the guards. The day's work was done, the engineers gone, the lights dimmed to a faint amber glow. The silence felt heavy, pressing against the walls. Every so often, the metal creaked, the slow cooling of steel and aluminum. Private Heller, one of the guards, paced near the wingtip to stay warm. His breath fogged the air in front of him. He kept glancing toward the cockpit, where the faint glimmer of light still reflected off the glass. He told himself it was the lamp behind him, nothing more. Then, faintly, he heard it, the soft click of a switch, followed by a whirring sound, low and mechanical. He froze. The bomber's propellers shivered once, just enough to catch the light. Heller's hand went to his rifle. "Who's there?" he called in German, his voice small against the cavernous hangar. No answer. The sound stopped. He approached the aircraft slowly, heart pounding. The air smelled faintly of oil and burned dust. He peered into the cockpit. Nothing. Just empty seats, dark instruments, the frozen curve of the horizon painted on the windshield. He stood there a moment longer, breathing hard, then laughed softly at himself. "Too much coffee," he muttered, turning away. Behind him, the altimeter needle twitched once, then stilled. By morning, the engineers returned, oblivious. The day's agenda was clear: reassemble the engines and prepare the aircraft for a test flight. A Luftwaffe pilot, Oberfeldwebel Richter, had volunteered to fly the captured fortress once the systems were confirmed safe. As they bolted the last panels back into place, Kruger watched from the catwalk above, a strange heaviness in his chest. He knew what the aircraft represented: a treasure, a triumph, perhaps even a turning point in the war. But part of him couldn't shake the thought that they were meddling with something that didn't belong to them. At midday, the engines roared to life for the first time since the capture. The sound filled the hangar, deep, rolling, alive. The German technicians cheered. The bomber trembled, rising slightly on its landing gear, as if recognizing its own heartbeat again. Kruger covered his ears against the thunder, but he couldn't look away. The machine was awake. And for a moment he could almost imagine it, lifting itself from the ground, rising through the hangar roof, climbing back into the gray sky, heading west, toward the sea, toward home. But the engines sputtered, coughed, and died. Silence returned. The men cheered anyway. To them, it was a victory. To Kruger, it was something else, a heartbeat that had stopped just short of escape. By the time news of the captured flying fortress reached Berlin, the story had already started to change. In Venlo, it had been a curiosity, an impossible landing, a machine without men. At Rechlin, it became a marvel of engineering and intelligence. But in the marble corridors of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, it became something else entirely, a weapon of narrative. The first press orders went out within 24 hours. Photographs of the captured American bomber will be released under strict supervision. The memo read, "The incident is to be presented as proof of the Luftwaffe's superiority and the enemy's technological weakness." Within days, the images appeared in the pages of Die Deutsche Wochenschau, Signal, and Der Adler. The photographs showed Luftwaffe officers proudly standing beside the massive aircraft, smiling for the camera. The black cross painted over the white star gleamed under the floodlights. Captions read, "Another American superfortress grounded by German skill and courage." No mention was made of how it had landed or that no one had been at the controls. Major Reinhard Kruger saw one of the papers during breakfast in the officers' mess. The photograph filled half the page. Himself, standing in front of the B-17 with his hands behind his back, expression neutral. He hadn't even realized the picture had been taken. Below, the caption read, "Major Kruger inspects a captured enemy bomber brought down by the heroic air defenses of the Reich." He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. Across the table, Oberleutnant Weber grinned. "Congratulations, Herr Major. You're a hero now." Kruger gave a dry smile. "Heroes usually choose their battles." Weber shrugged. "At least they spelled your name right. That's something." Outside the mess hall, the winter sun hung low, pale and cold. The base buzzed with a new kind of energy. Journalists, photographers, even officers from the Ministry of Propaganda had arrived to oversee a special demonstration. The plan was simple. Roll the captured B-17 onto the runway and let the world see it under the Reich's colors. By noon, a small crowd gathered along the edge of the airfield, soldiers, pilots, and curious technicians. Cameras were mounted on tripods. Kruger and his men stood by the bomber as mechanics towed it slowly into position. Its engines were silent this time, the propellers fixed at rest, the black crosses freshly painted. The Americans' faded nose art, the once elegant name Lady Be Good, had been scrubbed away. A propaganda officer approached Kruger, clipboard in hand, his expression sharp and rehearsed. "Major, we'd like you to stand closer to the nose for the photographs," he said briskly. "The image should emphasize German control over American arrogance." Kruger frowned. "You make it sound like we conquered it." The man smiled, unbothered. "In a way, we did. The Reich conquers with truth as well as firepower." He gestured toward the aircraft. "And truth, Major, is a matter of presentation." Kruger said nothing. He simply nodded and took his place. The camera flash went off once, twice, again. Each burst of light reflected in the bomber's polished metal. For a heartbeat, the aircraft looked alive again, caught between two worlds. The proud weapon it once was, and the symbol it had unwillingly become. That evening, the official newsreel was filmed. Under bright lights and careful choreography, announcers described the spectacular capture of an American heavy bomber that had dared to invade German skies. Actors in Luftwaffe uniforms climbed into the cockpit for the cameras, pretending to inspect battle damage. Lines were rehearsed, retakes ordered, until the footage gleamed with manufactured triumph. When the film was shown to officers that night, applause filled the small cinema. Laughter followed the final frame, the one showing the black cross painted boldly across the American star. Weber clapped Kruger on the shoulder. "We may not win the war," he said softly, "but we'll look good, losing it." Kruger didn't reply. His gaze stayed fixed on the flickering screen long after the lights came up. In the following weeks, the story spread across Europe. German newspapers claimed the Luftwaffe had forced the B-17 down through superior aerial tactics. In occupied France, posters appeared showing the bomber, with captions like, "American arrogance meets German precision." Radio Berlin broadcast dramatized versions of the event, complete with sound effects, where imaginary German pilots chased the enemy plane from the skies. Across the channel, Allied intelligence scrambled to verify what had happened. The U.S. 8th Air Force confirmed the loss of a B-17 on a Bremen raid, but details were scarce. Officially, the crew was listed as missing in action. Privately, some officers worried. If the Germans truly had a working fortress, they could study its weaknesses, its radio codes, its navigation systems. Orders went out. All subsequent missions would change encryption protocols and adjust bomb site calibration procedures. Back in Rechlin, Kruger's hangar had grown quieter. The engineers had finished most of their work, and the bomber now stood half reassembled, parts gleaming under the lamps. It looked ready to fly again, almost eager. But the excitement that had filled the air before was gone. The men had seen enough of the machine to respect it, and perhaps to fear it a little. Whispers spread. That strange sounds were heard inside the aircraft at night, that gauges moved on their own, that the radio hissed faintly when no power was connected. Most dismissed it as nonsense. A few didn't. One evening, after most of the base had gone to sleep, Kruger returned to the hangar. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. The bomber loomed in the half-light, wings stretched wide like a crucifix. He walked along the fuselage, trailing his hand across the cold metal. His reflection followed him, a blurred figure beside the ghost of an American star. In the cockpit, the seats were still empty, the controls untouched since the last test. On the throttle quadrant, faint fingerprints had appeared again where none had been before. He stared at them for a long moment, then whispered in English, barely audible, "Who landed you here?" No answer came, only the echo of wind through the rafters. The next morning, Kruger was summoned to Berlin for a private briefing. The propaganda campaign had been deemed a success. Göring himself wanted to see the aircraft, they said. Plans were underway to display it at Tempelhof, perhaps even to fly it, if it could be made airworthy again. As he prepared to leave, Kruger looked back at the hangar through the frost-covered window. The bomber stood in the middle of the floor, wrapped in the dim light of dawn. For a moment, he imagined it lifting its nose toward the west, straining against its chains, longing for the cold skies of home. Outside, a new headline appeared on the base's notice board: "The fortress that fell from the heavens." But those who had touched it, who had stood beneath its wings in silence, knew better. It hadn't fallen. It had arrived, alone, deliberate and haunted, a messenger from another sky that refused to explain itself. And now, in Berlin's hands, it would become not a story of mystery, but of power. Truth rewritten, metal repainted, silence replaced with applause. The Lady Be Good, once proud, once American, was now a prop in someone else's war. The train from Rechlin reached Berlin under a gray morning sky. The city trembled faintly with the sound of distant artillery. The war had come closer now, too close for comfort. Smoke hung in the air like a curtain that refused to lift. Posters still clung to the walls. Victory through sacrifice. Their colors faded, the paper peeling. Major Reinhard Kruger stepped onto the platform, briefcase in hand, the cold biting through his overcoat. He was met by a staff car from the Luftwaffe command. The driver, a young corporal, saluted nervously and opened the door. "Tempelhof, sir?" "Yes," Kruger said. "Straight there." The car drove through streets scarred by bomb craters and the smell of damp stone. Berlin was exhausted, a proud city wearing its wounds openly. Rubble filled alleys. Women in scarves pushed carts of coal past shattered windows. Somewhere in the distance an air raid siren wailed and faded again, a sound so routine now it barely turned heads. At Tempelhof airfield, the hangars loomed huge and silent. Inside one, surrounded by scaffolding and spotlights, stood the captured B-17, reborn yet again. The Black Cross had been freshly painted, the fuselage polished. The engines gleamed. It looked less like a prisoner now and more like a trophy. 2 men waited beside it, a propaganda minister in a dark coat and a Luftwaffe pilot with the confident air of someone used to applause. Kruger recognized him immediately. Oberst Hans-Joachim Richter, one of Göring's favored test pilots. "Major Kruger," the minister greeted, extending a gloved hand. "We are most grateful for your work. Truly exceptional. The Reich owes you a debt for bringing us this wonder." Kruger nodded politely. "It was the men at Rechlin who did the real work, sir. I merely—" "Nonsense," the minister interrupted. "Today we make history again. Herr Richter will fly your prize this afternoon. Imagine the message this will send to the world. A fortress under German control, flown above Berlin itself." Kruger's stomach tightened. "With respect, sir, that plane wasn't captured in combat. We don't know its full condition. It could be unstable." Richter laughed, a bright sound that didn't belong in this cold hangar. "You worry too much, Major. I've flown worse. Besides, the Americans will never believe it until they see it." He patted the silver skin of the bomber. "She's solid. She wants to fly." Kruger looked up at the cockpit. The sunlight coming through the hangar windows caught on the glass, throwing a pale shimmer across the floor. For a moment it looked as if someone were sitting inside. Then the light shifted, and the illusion vanished. By noon, the runway had been cleared. Journalists and officers gathered along the perimeter, cameras ready. The B-17 stood at the edge of the tarmac, engines ticking faintly as ground crews performed final checks. The air smelled of fuel and anticipation. Kruger stood apart from the others, watching in silence as Richter climbed the ladder into the cockpit. A few technicians followed, securing the radio and controls. When the engines started, the air thundered with power, deep, resonant, alive. The crowd applauded. The bomber began to move, slowly at first, then faster, rolling down the runway with a grace that didn't seem mechanical. Its nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. Against the cloudy sky, the black-crossed B-17 rose into the air like a ghost reclaimed. For several minutes, the plane circled above the city. Its engines droned steadily, echoing through the cold afternoon. From below, the onlookers cheered. Cameras clicked. The Reich's latest symbol of dominance soared above the very heart of its empire. Then something changed. The bomber began to climb higher, too high for a demonstration. It banked north, away from the airfield. The radio chatter grew confused. Voices crackled through the command tower, sharp and uncertain. "Richter, this is Tempelhof Control. You are off course. Respond." Static. Again. "Richter, acknowledge." Nothing. Kruger's blood ran cold. He grabbed a headset from a nearby officer and repeated the call himself. "Richter, it's Kruger. Report immediately." Still silence. Through the binoculars, the aircraft was now just a glint against the clouds. It turned west. Not north, not east. West, toward the direction of the channel. The engines roared once more, then faded into the overcast sky. No one spoke. The entire airfield stood frozen. For nearly half an hour, they watched the sky, waiting for a return that never came. Reports came in from scattered observation posts. The bomber had passed over Potsdam, then vanished into the clouds. No wreckage, no distress call, nothing. By dusk, the sun was gone, and with it the last trace of the aircraft. Kruger stood on the runway long after the others had left. The cold wind blew through his coat, carrying the faint echo of engines far beyond hearing. He didn't speak of what he suspected, that the plane had somehow continued the journey it had started months ago across the frozen air of another continent. In the weeks that followed, the Reich issued a statement. Test flight concluded successfully. Aircraft relocated for further study. No one asked where. No one dared. But among the ground crews, stories began to circulate again. That on quiet nights, when the wind blew from the west, they could still hear the steady, distant hum of 4 engines above the clouds. No searchlights ever found it. After the war, Berlin fell. The archives burned. Tempelhof's records vanished with the smoke of defeat. And somewhere in the ruins, a single photograph survived. The B-17 standing in this hangar, half in shadow, its black crosses still wet with paint. Years later, an Allied investigator found a copy of that image. On the back, in faded German script, someone had written one line. She wanted to go home. In the end, no one ever found the Lady Be Good again. Some said it was shot down over the North Sea. Others swore it made it across, flying on phantom fuel and determination, vanishing somewhere over England. A few old airmen, those who had once flown her sisters into combat, believed something else entirely, that the machine had remembered its duty and simply gone back to where it belonged. For Kruger, there were no answers. He disappeared after the collapse of the Reich, last seen leaving the British internment zone under a false name. Rumor said he became a mechanic in Hamburg, fixing civilian planes, avoiding questions about the war. Sometimes, when the sky darkened and a low drone passed overhead, he would pause, look up, and smile, as if hearing an old friend call his name. And in that sound, the throb of 4 engines against the horizon, the story of the fortress lived on. Not as propaganda, not as a weapon, but as a legend whispered between pilots, of a plane that refused to die, a machine that flew itself into enemy hands, and then, one final time, found its way home.